All right, so let's get started. This is our last book club of the season. My name is Alicia Tucker. I'm the Constitutional Literacy Fellow for the Center for Constitutional Studies, and this is sponsored by the Center for Constitutional Studies. And our purpose is to promote the practice of constitutional government and ordered liberty and the rule of law. And we do that through lots of programs like this, community programs, faculty research, teaching students at UVU, and also with K-12 initiatives. And we're also the home for this Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative, which was created by the Utah Legislature in 2021 to promote civic thought at the university level and then also at the community level. So this program helps to get at that objective for the Civic Thought and Leadership Initiative. So this is our third installment of our book club. We have talked about, or we have read part of Akilah Mar's book, The Words That Made Us. And we've also read The Myth of Left and Right by Hiram and Verlin Lewis. And so we're ending out the year with Revolutionary Mothers by Carol Berkin. And she, for a summary for the book to introduce us, a description for it says that the American Revolution was a home front war that brought scarcity, bloodshed, and danger into the life of every American. Berkin, the author, shows us that women played a vital role throughout the struggle. Berkin takes us into the ordinary moments of ordinary women, living in extraordinary times. We see women boycotting British goods in the years before independence, writing propaganda that radicalized their neighbors, raising funds for the army, and helping to finance the fledgling government. We see how they managed farms, plantations, and businesses while their men went into battle, and how they served as nurses and cooks in the army camps, risked their lives seeking personal freedom from slavery, and served as spies, saboteurs, and warriors. So we are talking about this book today, and so up here we have some what we call principal discussants. They will help us jumpstart the conversation, but we're hoping that the childhood friends, and we both live out here now, we grew up in Florida, but she runs a business from her home while also raising her 7 children and is very civically minded in teaching her children about civics, which we'll talk about that to close the conversation. We also have Pam Sua, who is our Civic Education Program Development Specialist here in the center. And her background before she came from the center, she was an educator in history and German in several school districts in Utah and Ogden and in West Jordan, or Jordan School District. And she helped to administer several Teaching American History grants, which from the federal government, they grant $1 million to school districts, so they were really exclusive, and Jordan School District got several of them, and one of them brought the author, Carol Berkin, to Jordan School District to teach teachers. So Pam has heard the author in the flesh. And Grace Yeager is one of our students here at the center. She's a Wood Fellow who works on our project, the Quill Project, with our partnership with Pembroke College to model negotiated text, meaning to identify the step-by-step of the deliberation of engagement and discussions that help us to show the final text, like the Constitution or other negotiations. So Grace is a secondary ed major for history teaching secondary ed. So she's a pre-service teacher and will be teaching high school or middle school after she graduates next year. And Shantae Ruiz Zundel is an attorney with a specialist in focusing on advocating for children as a guardian ad litem. And she's also on the board of a nonpartisan nonprofit that helps to elect women called Project Elect. And she is the mom of 2 littles who come to our programs for learners with littles. And so we're glad to have her here helping with this program as well. So to start off, in the introduction of the book, the author talks about how women when we think about the revolution, we often think of men as Minutemen turning out for battle, and then these great men writing these treatises, discussing, and then releasing the Declaration of Independence, and then winning on the battlefield. And so her question is, what were all the women doing? And so she writes that women wrote the first histories of the revolution, including Mercy Otis Warren, who published her 3-volume work in 1805, and also Esther Ellett, who wrote her work that's focused on the women during the Revolution, that was published at the time of the Seneca Falls Convention, when women first advocated for their political rights publicly in 1848. So women were the first to write the history of the war. But then something happened around the Civil War period where the profession of being a historian became professionalized. So we imported from Germany kindergarten and graduate school. And at the time, graduate school was only accessible to men. So men started to tell the stories of the revolution. So I want to hear from us, starting with Pam, because she's heard Carol Berkin talk about this in particular beyond the introduction. But what do you think about the importance of why we should tell women's stories?
Well, I'm going to start with a quote from Carol from Berkin. She says, "The history of America is a glorious stag party." It's all told from the history of men until about the 1970s. When she was doing her dissertation, she was interested in women's history. And so she went to her advisor and said, "I'd like to do something on women." And he said, "Well, that's wonderful, but you can't. There's no source, there are no sources, and there's nothing to say." And so she was not allowed to do her dissertation on that.
Could she use your mic?
Oh, can you not hear me? Oh.
If she doubles up the mic, will that work?
I can just hold my mic up to my mouth. Do you want me to do that? Let me do that. Okay. So she was told there was nothing to say about women. Later on in the 1970s, when there were more women in the history field, they started delving into the sources that men had put together, and they found diaries and they found letters, and they even found newspaper articles that women had written in their names during the Revolutionary War. And so they realized there is something to say about women, and we're going to start saying it.
That's great. Other thoughts? Like, why is it important to include women, and especially in our founding stories? Well,
women did most of the stuff. Yeah. I think each of us have a part to talk about what they did, but without this, I didn't know much about what women had done before. I knew Abigail Adams, and I had heard the stories of Molly Pitchers, but I didn't know the stories from regular women who were on the farms, who managed farms, who managed shops while their husbands were gone, and what they went through. I was ever so glad after finishing this book that I didn't live in the 1770s. They worked the livelong day and dropped into bed at night, and I work and drop into bed at night. So I was really glad I don't have to make soap and candles and, butcher hogs.
I think it's really important to hear the story of women because you can only tell your experience, right? You can empathize with other people's experience. So the narrative that we had for so long was purely from a man's perspective, which was valuable and is valid. But having the women be able to be given a voice that they clearly had, they were writing letters that were very intelligent and very astute in their observations about the war and the issues that were causing the war. It allows us to open that perspective and identify more with it, especially for me as a mother and woman in the United States, that I have a part, even though it has not been necessarily glorified and idealized. It is a valuable part because, like you said, the men were fighting and the women ran everything. They ran the businesses, the trade, the fundraising for the troops and things like that. It really was a remarkable feat to imagine for so long that women did not play a very crucial role in the Revolutionary period, because without the efforts of the women, it wouldn't have really gotten started as well. They stopped buying products, and that really promoted England to look at the effect that it was having on their bottom line, right? Because the women stopped buying. They were the purse strings of the families, and they really just were this undercurrent that was not given much credit, but really was kind of the tidal wave that pushed the revolution to success, I believe.
And I'll piggyback off of that. I like how you mentioned it's important being able to identify with these figures, like as a female. It's one of the most one of my favorite things about history is that you can see all of these ordinary people who become extraordinary when it's needed. And as a woman, I like being able to see other women who did that, so that I know that I can too.
Yeah. I'm sorry to speak so much on this, but this is very important to me. It oftentimes didn't get a lot of attention because it was just what needed to be done. And the women stepped up and did what needed to be done without the fanfare, right? Without the political parade, without the signing of the Declaration, without any of those things. They stepped into these roles that really supported the foundations of what made our revolution possible. And I think that that's generally, I mean, maybe I feel like this because I am a woman, but that's generally what happens. No matter the overwhelming task in front of you, it needs to be done, and so we do it every day, all day, again and again. And I loved that these were, like you said, totally normal women pushed to extraordinary feats of bravery, and I mean, get emotional, but it's just like, they did incredible things without recognition, and I'm so glad that they're being recognized.
Any thoughts from our audience about the importance of including women in the story of America?
I like the idea of understanding how families were involved, right? So you might have a father or brother or an uncle out fighting, but kind of in like collaboration with each other for a cause, that they had different roles to play, but for the same purpose. I think that's a powerful story for us now to consider, and that's kind of maybe in a way a heritage that we can draw on when we have we have voices from all who are involved.
So we touched on women and in their everyday lives, but helping to lead the boycott, which preceded the movement to decide to separate and have independence. So Grace, you had a few thoughts about women going about their ordinary lives and helping to start to change hearts and minds toward revolution.
Yeah. So as I was reading this book, a theme that was reoccurring was that these personal realms that these women lived in were becoming political. So the personal becoming political, and they would these like making clothing and drinking the tea and buying British goods were all things that happened within the home. And so I think when they felt as though their rights were being, what's the word? Their rights were being infringed upon. Thank you. They took it very personally because they were being, it affected their homes. And so I think that's why women were so invested in the early parts of the wars, because it was affecting what essentially was their realm at the time. And to add on, there's this quote in the last paragraph of the first chapter where it says that women, they began to think nationally and take their personal lives and make it a national issue.
Yeah.
So they wouldn't have called it boycotting, but they would have called it non-consumption.
Yeah.
But the power of women and the economic decisions that they were making for their home.
Well,
That became national.
I love this quote here. It says, in South Carolina, the Presbyterian minister William Tennant III insisted that women could save the colonies from the dangers of tyranny if they gave up the trivial pleasure of drinking tea. And he said, "Yes, ladies," he declared, "you have it in your power more than all of your committees and congresses to strike the stroke and make the hills and plains of America clap their hands." Because they were the purse strings of so much of the purchase power, and it was an important trade for the English to monopolize on. And when they said no more and we're going to stop buying it, it wasn't easy. They loved their tea, right? They loved their clothes. They loved their nice things. But they were willing to put their money where their mouth was and stand by their desire for more liberty and more access to fair representation and all of those things. They didn't even know really the impact I think that it was going to have, but it was the catalyst that sent them forward, right? And gave power to all their husbands that they were supporting. Like, how would you feel coming home and your wife is sacrificing? It is a cyclical thing where you feed off of each other with doing hard things and doing the right thing and moving forward with things that you believe in.
One of the sacrifices that they made that I think is really inspiring was they stopped buying British cloth.
Yes.
And they started spinning Liberty cloth.
homespun.
So Carol Berkin says that there's nothing more boring than spinning, except perhaps watching bass fishing on ESPN. She says
Yes.
it was the worst thing to do. They gave it to the unmarried women, which is why they called them spinsters. But they would get together and they'd come to the parson's lawn and they'd have 100 spinning wheels and they'd spin and spin and spin and they'd wear these homespun dresses. And so when finally things were gone, they really enjoyed getting back to the British cloth and the French hats.
And the silk
And they were very excited to not have to wear these dresses anymore.
And that they're building community
Yeah.
when they're doing this, and so they're sharing their thoughts together.
It was like a forum for sharing ideas because they came together. It was the first, knitting circle or, social sewing bee, book club, where they could come together and talk and realize that other women had really profound and commitments, and it bolstered them when it was hard to skip their tea and when it was hard to wear clothes that weren't as cute. So. Or cute at all. That's true.
And you see like those themes you've all kind of touched upon within the Edenton Resolves, the program which they created.
I love
and
that.
just like organization, their ability, the female sex is not just quivering in the corners. It was, who said this? Arthur Iredell, I believe, said, "I hope not is there a female Congress at Edenton too? I hope not, for we Englishmen are afraid of the male Congress, but if the ladies who have ever, since the Amazonian era, been esteemed the most formidable enemies, if they, I say, should attack us, the most fatal consequences is to be dreaded."
I love that.
And
That's so good.
And I mean, we still kind of have that idea of women. We shorten it and we talk about mama bearing. But if you attack our families, if you attack our children, we go mama bear on you, and we are a feared sex because we do have a strength within us.
Yeah, and for Edenton, that was when some elite women were getting together to boycott the tea.
Yeah.
And then word of that got to England, and it was ridiculed, that they're doing this masculine activity. They're entering politics, but they are. But because it was so close to what they were doing in their homes, that the political and the personal got bridged very easily. So let's talk about how the author focuses on how the Revolutionary War was a home front war. think the way that we learn about the Revolutionary War when we were in 5th grade or 8th grade, it's that it's maybe these battles that were fought valiantly on a battlefield, and we might romanticize it a little bit, but there was suffering that everybody experienced on both sides, and this book reflects that, the complexity of each person's experience. It wasn't that there were the good Americans and the bad British. It was that everyone suffered because it was wartime. So Shantae, you had some thoughts about the complexity of a home front war.
Yeah, and kind of to touch on that, the loyalist versus patriot, I think Miss Berkin does an excellent job throughout the book of not pitting one against the other, but really the perspective of throughout is entwined, and there exists on both ends similarities and differences. But that home front war really brought out the violence against women, because women were in the home. Women were the home was what was under attack as British troops would come in, and cannonballs flying through your living room. Like on a personal experience, I grew up in a pretty rough neighborhood. I have experienced a drive-by shooting, and it is terrifying to fear that you might actually die and that your home is under war. And so just that's small of an experience, but these women, they had so many experiences. Within chapter 3, she talks about rape, which is not often. Rape is often minimized and not discussed, as seen as a taboo of not to brought up. But she addresses it and talks a bit about how a female's body was considered a spoil of war. One of the British officers, Lord Rawdon, even greeted the news of the rape of local women with amusement. And he praised one woman for her sophistication in not complaining about after 7 men raped her. And that was considered, oh, well, you took over, so you can take the bodies of these women. And it's just horrifying. And these were children, even as young as 10. And I think that's important to talk about, because even in our day, we can minimize that those types of activities, but they also existed then. I think something I talked about with you, Alicia, is we like to idealize our founding fathers. I mean, I'm definitely guilty of it. I may or may not have a bust of George Washington in my house due to my husband. We love our founding fathers, we praise them, but at the same time, this home front war isn't a one-off. We see the things, one occurrence that I think is amazing is looting. The women looted. It was I love it. They heard of a Connecticut merchant holding back sugar supply, and so they organized. They in the newspaper, a corps of female infantry of 20 rank and file with a flank of 3 chosen spirits of the male line. They organize, but in certain circumstances, when we see other looting, we appall it. We think they're just trying to take advantage of a situation, and it's always about perspective of what happens in your world and what you idealize and who you connect with. And so I think this is an important chapter of talking about that home front war, because I feel, especially, I think most people in this room are Americans. If you're not, still love you. But so we idealize our ancestors, we idealize the people that have created this nation, but also, and we abhor the culture that has occurred today that we feel is so far from that, but really we're not that far from them, both in our ability to evoke good, to help our nation, and also to hurt and to hinder. And I think that's something I took away from Miss Berkin. Anybody
in the audience have any thoughts about the home front war that was a strong theme in the book.
It's interesting looking at historical events like this, or particularly revolutions. Revolutionaries didn't really know the outcome of what was going to happen. Or were they going to be on the good side? Were they going to be or the winning side? And not only that, their neighbors would likely have been loyalists, and they would have been having to kind of navigate that landscape of us versus them throughout there. And I would like to think that women were probably a mainly involved in that because women, we connect with one another. That's what we are. That's what we do. And so to have a neighbor or a family member that possibly was on the opposite side of the conflict, like, that would have been extremely challenging. And again, like, not knowing, I don't know if, me boycotting this, I don't know if me sending my son to go fight in this revolution, I don't know what the outcome's going to be. Like, I don't know if it's going to be what I want it to be. So I think that's interesting. That's a good perspective to have when we're thinking about revolutions, of like, they really didn't know what the final outcome would be.
I think uncertainty is such a powerful vein throughout this whole thing. The uncertainty of people on the side of the loyalists, the colonials, when we discussed, the African American slaves that were left in these positions with just so much uncertainty. It's so true. Like, when we are committed to something, you can't control, once the ball's rolling, you can't control the outcome. And it does leave an immense amount of insecurity that can make you weaken your resolve. And I think that it shows many examples on both sides where it was too much. This home front war and the burden it placed on their family, and the loss of family members and siblings and income and homes, and virtue crushed them, as it does so many people. But there are hopeful stories where it galvanized them. And I think that is important to recognize, that humanity is victim to uncertainty, and it can make or break you. And that's part of the beautiful and terrible story of being a person, Anyway.
And kind of touching on like the women and how their humanity for each other and caring for each other, and towards the end of the 3rd chapter, they talk about them organizing and going and seeking out funds to help the colonialists and the colonial army for George Washington, and getting funds. But they were very strategic about it. If they knew of a woman that didn't have a lot, or a family that was poor, they intentionally skipped over it. And some of them would like run at them like, "Hey, take my money," but more eloquent than I say it. But it was quite empowering to see that they were caring for each other, but also they knew they had to sacrifice, but they wouldn't let those that couldn't sacrifice as much sacrifice. They watched out for them. So I think that's a wonderful thing, especially about women. My opinion.
So let's talk about a theme that you touched on about the relationship between the loyalists and the patriots. That if when we've learned about the revolution in the past, that we're so proud of the patriots, but there were a lot of loyalist women, and especially in the South, there were a lot of loyalists, and because of that, the nature of the conflict took on more of a civil war aspect, where it was like more of neighbors against neighbors. So what were, if you had any thoughts about the experience of loyalist women, and as in comparison to the Daughters of Liberty, who were raising funds for the Continental Army and others?
So I think, Elisha, you've hit on a big thing, that it really was a civil war to a lot of these people. So Esther Sewell, who was married to Jonathan Sewell, who was John Adams' best friend, her sister married John Hancock. So Jonathan Sewell was a loyalist. John Hancock obviously was a patriot, and so in their family it was sister against sister, and in many cases neighbor against neighbor and brother against brother. So these loyalist women. So there was a historian in the 1970s, Bernard Bailyn, who called the loyalists the losers, because because they lost. But I think there's something heroic about them because they remained loyal to the crown. They wanted to support what they believed in and didn't feel like they could change sides. And even though their neighbors were pushing, and like this lady back here mentioned, neighbor against neighbor was often what happened. Your very best friends were against you and caused some of the suffering. So the loyalist women went through the very same suffering that the patriot women did. They had the scarcities. Their homes were burned. Their homes were ransacked. They took their furniture. They took their livestock. All of the same things that happened to the patriots happened to the loyalists, but in many cases it was their neighbors. And so I like Esther Sewell's story, which you read in this chapter, where a group of men and boys came to look for her husband, Jonathan, who had gone to Boston. And they were throwing rocks at her house and calling out, "Send Jonathan out." And she went to the door and said, "He's not here. We know he's here. Let us have him." She says, "Come in and look. And while you're here, why don't you, enjoy his wine cellar?" So they came in. They went to his wine cellar, they sat and drank and drank and drank, and eventually were very happy and left and went home. But these were her neighbors, men she knew and men that she associated with on a regular basis. And the chapter is full of stories of loyalist women who were doing what they thought was right. This is my favorite story was, and I don't know her name, a loyalist farmer went off to, I don't know if he went to fight or if he went to England, but he left her in charge of the farm, and he left her very detailed notes about how to take care of the farm. Go down the path, turn to the left, and there is a tool that is a shovel, and this is what it looks like, and this is what you do with it, and this is how you plant with it. And because, of course, women couldn't take care of a farm, very detailed instructions. So in a while, he wrote back to her and said, "How is my farm doing?" And she said, "Your farm is doing well." She kept working and got to know things, and when he asked her the next time in a few months how his farm was doing, she said, "Our farm is doing well." A few months later, when he asked her, she said, "My farm is doing well." And I think this shows the mindset. The women's minds were changing. Look at what I can do. Look at what I have done. Na, 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 na.
Yeah. Capability gives a lot of confidence.
Yeah.
Alicia, I really liked the story of Grace Galloway that's at the beginning of this chapter. I really liked this chapter just in general. I thought it was really interesting. Grace Galloway was the wife of Joseph Galloway, who was a leading member of the Continental Congress, but after independence was declared, he would not renounce his allegiance to the king, so he remained loyal. And the thing that I took away from this story was that, so she would have been considered a gentle woman, which at the time, the rules of combat, like combat etiquette, was you don't target higher ranking officers, you don't target like gentle, like what's considered like higher class women. And I think there was a shift in the revolution, which is part of the reason that the Patriots won the revolution, is because they shift the etiquette. And that is reflected in how some of these women were treated, which I thought was like an interesting parallel. That these like gentle women who were considered higher class were not safe from conflict in that way.
And so women like Grace had to leave their homes eventually. And so here they had been used to luxury and title and wealth, and Grace couldn't go anywhere. There was no one that would take her in. Her parents wouldn't take her in, and this was the case with very many families who were patriot families who didn't want their loyalist daughters and their children to come live with them. And so many of them went into exile in Canada or to Bermuda or back to England. Very often the women had to get permission to go, and they could go, but if their sons were 12 years old or older, they had to stay and serve in the Continental Army. And so that was a difficult decision for these loyalist women to make. And the Patriots didn't know whether to encourage the women to leave or to stay, because if they let the women stay, they knew that they might be a good source of information to get to their husbands serving in the army. And so it was a real difficult dilemma for them to deal with.
She had a lot of spunk.
Yes.
She wrote that poem, and she was very miffed that she couldn't hold on to her property. She couldn't take care of her house. All of these people had turned their back on her. And she realized that being loyal to her husband meant you were also loyal to his ideas and his whims and his politics. And she wrote this funny poem. It says, "Never get tied to a man, for once you are yoked, 'tis all a mere joke of seeing your freedom again." And so she ended up having this sort of, and often, history is told by the people that win. And had the loyalists won, they would have been great heroes of integrity and virtue. And I think that I like how she supported that they still had a nobility, because we do sometimes think of the loyalists as not great. But they did have a nobility, that they thought they were doing what was right. And it really was crappy to find out that you didn't get to keep anything. You couldn't change your mind.
I'd like to talk about the theme that Grace introduced for us, but Leah and I had talked about earlier about women who followed the army, and how women who were poor and considered wretched were treated differently than officers' wives. So when in listening to a talk of Kara Berkin about this, she said that when she first started researching women who followed the army, who were called camp followers, the connotation was that they were all prostitutes. But she learned in her research that they actually were the sweethearts and the wives of the men in the army, and that Washington found them very annoying because they were a strain on the resources, but he knew that he couldn't send them home because a lot of the men would desert. So they have a lot of these, and for the women who left home to follow their husbands into the army, it was usually because they didn't have money to sustain themselves at home. They didn't have property, and they didn't have the protection. So that these poor women, and then their role as camp followers or women in the army, they served the role as a quartermaster corps, where they did all the cooking and cleaning and the laundry that in modern armies and militaries would be provided by the military itself. Mm-hmm. So there was a different experience for the camp followers, or women who followed the army, and the officers' wives, who would come when they would rest in the wintertime on both sides of both armies. Mm-hmm. They would rest in the winter, settle down, wait for the snow to melt, and Martha Washington and Lucy Knox and Katie Green would come and visit their husbands, and they would have balls with the officers. So you had some thoughts about the difference between how the women were treated.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting, and I think it's still a really prevalent problem today that poverty is a discriminatory thing. And you see it in the other observations. So much of the book is written off of journals and observations and letters that have been donated to historical foundations and things. And the description of the women by just observers, other women in the community, was very degrading and very dehumanizing, and they were wretched creatures, they were filthy, they were disgusting, they didn't want them, the army tried to make them follow a day behind because they didn't want the stigma of this group of very needy, not by necessarily fault of their own, group of women and children and disabled men even were in the group of the camp followers. But it felt like the people who relied on employment by the army were painted with a brush that is just very unfair. And I think it's still a problem today that poverty is a stigma that is very hard to overcome. And it often doesn't get a lot of attention because it isn't glamorous, and we all like to pretend like we would never do that. But dirty, stinky, it's hard to deal with. And it was especially apparent when they then would write about when the generals' wives came. And we do want to love the balls and the pretty clothes and the gentle women who could come and succor those in need and bestow their kindness upon others. It's a very glamorous role, but very unfair in my opinion. And I really couldn't help but parallel that to today, that we still have this problem of people that rely on employment tend to get a bad rap, unfortunately, even though it's the American dream. Get a job, work hard, make your life come true. But it's still around, and it really was so obvious reading this. It just felt really sad.
I really saw that discrimination of poverty versus wealth within my work as a child advocate, especially when children of a family were removed for different reasons from a home, and then they got placed with relatives, an uncle or a great uncle or grandparents. And then the parents, they would, within the child welfare system, they have an opportunity to get their lives in order a certain amount of time. And some of the families, they did that. They did as the court asked of them. They were meeting their goals. They were getting sober, whatever it might be. And so we're getting closer to that time of reunifying the family. But their other relatives that have been taking care of the kids come in and say, well, but they're not making very much money. They're working at Burger King, and we're paying for him to go to football. A lot of the conversations were, well, they're in all these extracurricular activities that we're paying for, and if they go home, we're not going to pay for it, and they can't pay for it. So is that really the best interest of the child? Like, we can provide so much more. And I would have that conversation so many times with families, and I would say, I appreciate that you love this child and that you have these funds that you could do all these things for him, but that's not necessarily the best interest. It's about being with their family and their family meeting the legal standards and being able to raise their child, even if that's not how you would do it. Just because they're poor, that's not, like, so many times I would say this, and the judge would even say, just because they're poor is not a reason to remove a child from their family. It's a reason to provide services. It's a reason to be supportive. It's a reason to step in as that family member and help out in the way you can, and not just belittle them, which you saw so much in that chapter of, like, these women, and they talk about them being harsh and non-genteel. It's like, well, they're cleaning up your poops. They're fine.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they don't have access to the kind of refining education, or the education accessible for women here, and we'll talk more about that at the end. It was what was accessible to women was about refinement, and women who are doing all the laundry and the cooking and scraping by in the Army, they're not having access to that kind of, the way those who are writing calling them wretched creatures, what they would have viewed as a valuable woman.
But they did perform crucial tasks within the camp that helped prevent disease and many other terrible things that plagued the camp. But they suffered right along with the soldiers,
And in terms of the hierarchy of who got the resources in the Army, the men got it first.
Absolutely.
So then they're getting the scraps at the end.
Half of the followers, it says in one, didn't have shoes on, were wearing bare legs in the middle of winter. It was really just a terrible situation to be in.
Yeah, and I was talking to my husband about the gender pay gap within this, because they had nurses, if they were the women that were taking care of the sick were paid 10% of what the male counterparts were receiving. I was like, that's a big gender.
And received 10% rations, and I mean, it was really unfortunate. Anyway.
Any thoughts from the audience about the experience of women who followed the Army, whether they were doing the work of the Army or visiting socially? So let's talk about spies for a minute, because women were often overlooked as not really knowing what's going on, and so they made really good spies. Mm-hmm. So Grace, you had some thoughts about women as spies.
Yeah, I think I'll start off by saying how much I love this cover. Like, I'm looking at it, and she's in this beautiful dress that has all these different layers, and she's holding a rifle, and like she's looking around the corner, and I just think I thought that was really just
Can I tell you the story of who this is?
I would love that.
Mm-hmm. Whoops. So this woman is Abigail Hinman, and the story is taken from her family history, so it's a legend, but based on truth. So here she is in her beautiful rose satin with lace, holding the musket. The man on the horse, which you can see partially in the window there, is Benedict Arnold. And she was the only one that remained in the town of New London, Connecticut, when everybody fled, because she expected her husband, a Navy captain, home to help save the town, he and his men, where they were storing arms. So Benedict Arnold rode into town, and he had been a family friend of Abigail's. And they had had dinner with her many times, so he rode up to her house and said, "If you'll tell me which of these homes is yours, I won't burn it." So she pointed out several of her neighbors' homes and said, "These are all my home." And so he didn't burn those. But he sat in her yard and watched them destroying the town. You can see the homes in flame on the cover. And she was so disgusted. There were many atrocities that happened that day. And she was so disgusted with that she ran and got this musket, waited till he was close enough. She took aim and fired, and it misfired. But it made a loud noise. And so he rode over to the house and said, "What was that noise?" And she said, "Oh, I broke a chair." But that's the story of who this is.
That's so funny.
I love it.
That's really funny. Yeah, but I think being underestimated was one of their most powerful tools. I can just have a couple of the stories where they would have to go through some type of British fence sentry, and I can just picture it you have these very these ladies who are wearing their big dresses, and they have their hair all done, and they have their cute little baskets that they're carrying, but the baskets aren't for bread, it's for a letter to Colonel Washington. I think that's a very cool picture to paint just for myself. And I going along with spies, I also really loved the stories of all the, saboteurs. And this lady, her name was Rebecca Mott, I think. And she, rather than allowing the British to use her home, she allowed the Patriots to set it on fire. And I just thought, that is so hardcore. And again, I think that goes back to kind of how the personal was becoming political. Her home is her personal realm, what would have been her personal realm. And she, rather than compromising her beliefs, she allowed it to be destroyed for her, for a cause, which I think is really cool.
And again, I think you could see the mindset of women changing. You can't have girls that are doing these kind of things and women who are doing these kind of things and not have them have a different opinion of who they are. I just want to share my favorite story real fast. This is a story of Mammy Kate, who was, and this is a quote, "the biggest, the tallest, the most imposing negress in Georgia." And her master, Stephen Hurd, had been captured by the British and was taken to a fort, and she decided that she was going to rescue him. So she went to the fort and said that she would like to become a laundress. And of course they loved that, because this was a big deal. They needed laundresses. So she got a great big basket, and she would take it in. She would come out with their dirty laundry. She would iron the ruffles perfectly so that the officers loved it. She'd take the clean laundry back in her big laundry basket.
She carried it on her head.
Carried it on her head. And after she had done this for a couple of weeks, she asked if she could do the laundry of her master, Mr. Hurd. And they said, "Okay, sure, go ahead." So she did that. And one day she left with dirty laundry with the big basket on her head, and also Stephen Hurd in the basket.
Yeah.
So she got him out of the fort, and he was not executed.
He was a diminutive man,
Yes,
they said.
yes, he was a very small
So
man.
he got in her basket, and
But
she
I
carried
love
it out on
that.
her head.
I love that. How can you not love stories like that?
I know.
Well, and his reward for her was her
Yes,
freedom,
yes.
Yeah.
and gave her land, and she had many children.
Yes.
17 children.
Yeah.
Crazy.
But her story is in contrast greatly with most of the experiences of enslaved women. So there's a chapter about enslaved women, and starts off with, in 1775, Lord Dunmore, who's the governor of Virginia, gives a proclamation that says, for those enslaved people, but he was aiming for the men, who are enslaved by rebels, or the Americans, if you come and fight on the side of the British, then we'll give you your freedom. And so about 800 men responded, but at the same time women also responded and came to his ship. But eventually, what was probably smallpox broke out among what they called the Ethiopian regiment, or the enslaved men and men who came to the British side. And about 500 of them died, and eventually he didn't want the smallpox to spread to his men, and so they just abandoned them.
Didn't they maroon them?
Yeah, marooned them on an island out
Outer
in
Banks.
Chesapeake Bay. So, but that started off the experiences of talking about which side would enslaved people decide to try to support. Is it going to be the British or the Americans? Are they just going to try to seek their own freedom and leave? Would it be safer for them to stay in their current position when masters are away and the inflicting or extracting labor is not so severe because the priority is not growing things on the plantation as much? So for many enslaved women, whether they stayed at the plantation or left, then their circumstances sometimes were not better in leaving. But for some of them, they ended up being evacuated at the end of the war, and the British Army helped some of them relocate to Nova Scotia. But does anybody want to share what happened to them in Nova Scotia? Anybody remember? Sure.
Well, they set up this colony, and again, it was the worst land. It just is so sad that these disenfranchised groups over time, especially the enslaved people in these stories, they lived with so much uncertainty, and both sides of the coin were not great. And even the hope that things would be better someplace else kind of turned to ashes there, where they were given land that was unproductive, and there was no food sent and no sustenance to help them get started. They had no equipment to build their homes. And this is in Nova Scotia, Canada, where many of these people are from the south. They're not used to the cold. And the colony, I think it was like Brimtown or something, Birchtown was basically decimated. And many of them ended up leaving. Very few of them ended up staying in Nova Scotia. And many of them went on a ship actually back to Africa to try to re-establish themselves there. But it was no good options. It's like usually you pick up a stick and one side's okay, and the consequences aren't great. But there was just so much. It's just terribly unfair what happened. They were double-crossed, and many of the loyalists that took these enslaved people ended up claiming them as spoils of war and selling them to other people or sending them to the West Indies. And it was just a terrible black spot that I didn't ever know was so awful as a part of the revolution. We know about the atrocities of the Civil War and slavery in general. I actually thought the story about Mammy Cape was really brave of them to include, because in every bad situation, there are people who choose to be better, right? This owner clearly had a level of respect and camaraderie with his slaves. Even if it was only Mammy Kate, she felt a loyalty and a love for her master. And I think it's hopeful that I'm so sorry, that there are people in awful situations where there aren't a lot of options to do good, that choose to be better. And anyway, sorry to
I think a big difference in this chapter versus all the other chapters is the narrative that's not included in this chapter because it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
The historical, there are diaries of the women. There is a written history there, but that didn't necessarily exist for the Black individuals. And so this chapter had to be treated slightly different in that it talked of numbers a lot.
Yeah.
There was of course there's still the
Registers.
individual stories, like Mary Postle's story of gaining her freedom and then losing it by a white man lying, and so he's believed by the courts and not her, and she's back in her slavery. But I think it's important as we're reading this, those numbers each represent an individual story, and I think stories hit with us as human beings. We hear a story and we can relate, we can find some meanings, but numbers we can often kind of skew over. And so with slavery, when we talk about the numbers, we can skew that, but those are that has to represent a person or a family. She talks about whether slave or free, African American women struggle to establish and maintain a family. And I think about that now, if I can't imagine being the mother that I am and having absolutely no power to protect my children and keep them safe. And these were mothers that their families were getting destroyed and they had no power. We took our kids about 2 years ago. So the oldest was about 3.5. Took them to Mount Vernon. So excited. They love, we had a picture of Mount Vernon in their room. So like she recognized it. She saw Mount Vernon. She's like, Mount Vernon! And there's a section that they created where they excavated quite a few years ago and found it there to be a graveyard. And they discovered it was a graveyard of George Washington's slaves. And as I mentioned before, we love George Washington in our house. He is a hero. But my husband, he took that moment just to let it sit that George Washington had slaves, and that was wrong. And he didn't qualify it in that moment. And there's times that you have to explain the context of history. You have to explain that, that he did free his slaves upon his death. But that was a moment to just let it sit that that was a wrong thing to do. And let her learn from that. And she hates slavery. She abhors it. And I'm so happy as a 5-year-old she abhors slavery. I'm like, yay, I'm doing something right. But it's okay not to give slavery its context all the time and just let it be morally wrong and have that be the end. Because I think about like the injustices that happened in this chapter, I feel like they can pale in comparison to the infringement of rights that the loyalists had placed upon the patriots. It's so minimal in comparison, but it's so glossed over in history books and in our discussions of the Revolutionary War.
Yeah.
Anybody in the audience have any thoughts about the chapter about enslaved women? Well, let's talk about Native American women, because there's a chapter on Native women, and Shantae, her heritage is White Mountain Apache. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, how did you respond as a Native woman, seeing how the author treated their stories, and then also learning about the stories of the women she told?
I just love that we weren't erased. It felt so like, oh, Native women existed. Yes, we did. We're here. I love that. And I love that, especially the women in the different tribes, like she treated the different tribes as different nations in which we are. We're not all one, when the discussion of Native American populations happened, it's often grouped, but she took the time to explain that much like Europe, different cultures, different sentiments, and different ideals. And so I just love that. And I love that she really went into depth of like how matriarchal some of the societies were and how that really rubbed every white person the wrong way. It's like, oh, whoa, you ask your women what to do? No, that's crazy. But it is. Women are an important part of society that shouldn't be erased. And I love that some tribes feel that way. I mean, even now, like within some of the, so different tribes do their different registrations differently. And some are matriarchal in that you have to prove through the mother's line that your blood is through that tribe in order to register. And oftentimes we think of, well, it's you get the father's name, you have it's your father. It's not like, I mean, things happen. Sometimes a child born is not the father's, but it's always the mother's.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so I love that she addressed the Native women and the Native organization, because I think there is always something to learn there from every different culture. And women are, like when I say women are part of the house, so within my organization, Project Elect, we're very focused on having women elected, not because we think women are better or anything like that, but because when we are involved, there are better decisions are being made, that we should be a part of those conversations because we are a society of men and women, and people should be making those decisions. And there was a study done as talked about the difference women make, the policy impact of women in Congress, that just shows the overall benefits of having women involved, the policy decisions that they've put forth, not partisan, but just generally women caring for lots of different groups. And within even the Seneca, there was a Seneca faith leader who talked about making decisions. She didn't talk about this. This reminded me of it. The Seneca faith leader talked about making decisions with 7 generations in mind. And I think that beautifully exemplifies the thoughts of our founding fathers. Mm-hmm. They created a constitution. They created a government system that wasn't just for themselves, even though the loyalists would argue, oh, they're arrogant, they want power, they just want money, and they're bringing along the poor with them. They very much had that Seneca thought of, let's create something that can exist for generations, and it has. And whether or not it continues to exist is part of that great experiment and up to us to decide. But I think by addressing that Native perspective, we can learn from it and grow from it. And Native isn't just my heritage, it is our nation's heritage. Mm-hmm. Because we as Americans, Black, white, bond free, it's part of our culture, and we should revel in it because there's so much good in it.
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry. It was my soapbox. I'm done.
That's good. One of my thoughts that in learning about the revolution that I think is unfortunate is that the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois Confederacy was the peace agreement among the 5 nations in what is now around New York. That was created about 200 years before the revolution, and that peace agreement stayed until they had to decide which side, are they going to support the British or are they going to support the Americans? So that agreement was broken when their new enemies came in, and they had to decide which side, what would be in their best interest. Mm-hmm. And so the chapter talks about Molly Brant, who's navigating Mohawk, the tribes, the traditions of the Mohawk, while at the same time with white society, and that the Mohawk were very matriarchal. But because of her position, then she was able to help to be an ambassador between the two, but it was with the British. So when the Americans lost, or when the Americans won and the British lost, then the interactions with the Native people were influenced by colonial culture or American culture, and made their societies more patriarchal in the influence, because that's who they would talk to when they were creating these kinds of treaties. So it influenced the practice and culture of the Native people as the Americans got more successful and moved into their lands and started to compete more for the lands too.
Yeah. And like the discussions now occur about, Indian Child Welfare Act and different programs to support the nations, and if those are race-based, but they're really, from my perspective as a Native person and as an attorney, the nations are just that. They're sovereign nations. It's about their political identity, and starting with the Revolutionary War, and it has been picked apart piece by piece as we see in the progression of our nation. Most recently within the 70s, it was very I hate to say popular, but popular to remove children from Native tribes and put them with white families because they were affluent, they could take care of them. These reservations were poor. These children have no future. And so along with part of my family is they were removed from those nations. And those nations are dwindling and are hanging on by a thread, and we still need them. They're still part of our culture. And so I think it is important that, the things that we lost, that we try as much as we can to help establish and maintain them as possible.
So let's wrap up with the last part about Berkin argues that about the legacy of the revolution, that it was a transformation. So legally and in society, women were considered, before the revolution, were treated legally as weak-minded. They didn't have this moral capability. It was viewed that she says that students often presume that women were always responsible for raising their children. But before the revolution, that the women birthed the babies and fed the babies, but the men were the morally capable ones that were raising them or teaching them and preparing them for adulthood. But the revolution changed all that because of the experiences that they had in living through hardship and being able to show, like Pam made the point, that when you start to have these experiences that you see yourself as more capable and intelligent, then at the end of the war, what the author calls the woman question arose, where women were no longer viewed as much as dependents as they were before, but there started to be, like, women were more involved. They were politically engaged, and they were showing in society that there was this intellectual ability and moral capability. So the shift happened that now women, maybe they should be educated, and that they now have this responsibility to educate the children, because we've created this republic where every citizen matters in engaging and keeping this experiment in liberty going. So did anybody have any thoughts about this transformation that happened at the revolution?
Yeah, I do. I've got a quote here from page 154. So women felt it was their duty to be this new Republican mother. It is our task to inspire her brothers, her husband, and her sons with such a love of virtue and just such ideas of the true value of civil liberty that future heroes and statesmen shall exultingly declare, "It is to my mother I owe this elevation." But the men still wanted them to be genteel and play the piano and sing songs and read books and not tell the men in their family who to vote for. So I think if you look at the enlightenment that had started earlier, I think that plus the experiences the women had gone through helped them to think more about what they could do now. And they became the glue that held together this revolutionary generation and the next generation. And so they said, if you want us to do this, if you want us to have this civic role, we need education. So a lot of young ladies' academies sprang up in all of the states, and they learned geography, and they learned history, and they learned all these great things. I think it's very easy to then take. So once they learn about the world, once they've learned about politics and about more rights, even though they didn't have it, it's a straight line to Seneca Falls. You can see how those ideas came from what they were experiencing after the revolution.
Well, what I think is so interesting is that the idea that most of the education came from the men, I think is fundamentally not accurate. I mean, educationally, in formal education, yes, they were the people that were doing the teaching, but the women were home and teaching all day, every day, how to do things. And it's interesting that women had this, all these officers were writing home to their wives, calling them their delicate flower and giving them instructions on what a shovel is. And I just kind of read that and kind of laughed and thought, when you are off, who is doing everything? It's your wife. And she's showing your children how to skin a cow or, pluck a turkey and cook a thing and make candles. And she worked, one of the quotes was, "I worked tirelessly and I fell into that," these stories of these women who didn't even know that they were being political because they were doing what they have always done. And I think that is sort of a false narrative, that men were the primary moral teachers of their families, because your primary teacher is in the home, and your mother was in the home at the threshold telling you, I'm unhappy with the way you're treating her and things like that. And then it did shift, because I think there became this displeasure that women didn't feel it was enough to go unrecognized doing all of the things in the background. And they began to realize that we have to have a say. We can have a say because we proved it in our efforts here in the revolution. We can have a say, and they demanded more of a forefront to claim that power of educating their children. And I think that it was always there, but they hadn't claimed that authority and that power. And after the revolution, they had more courage because they had gained that confidence through proving their capability of reasoning and doing all of these heroic things out of their normal and everyday lives. And so I kind of disagree with the idea that that it was a new thing that women began to be an educating source, but that they demanded to be informed was a new thing. They demanded to have access to information that they did not have prior to the revolution.
Sorry. And I just, part of like with that education of women and like the creation of those women institutions of education, I find it, I kind of laugh at them because they also knew the strength of education, because specifically within the Black communities, after people, tried for the loyal, they tried to gain their freedom, they had stricter laws for segregation and could not teach your slaves how to read. That was against the law because they knew that education provides liberty and freedom. And that's what we were taking at that time that we're able to, is getting that education, because that was the stepping stone towards our liberty and freedom. And that's, as you see, as revolutions come and go, it's always through education. That's how it starts.
Because you can only do as much or as good as you know, and the more education you get and the more opportunity you're given, the more you demand equality, because that's the true, better place.
I was just going to say one thing. The line from that old, is it World War I? Is it World War I song, Matthew? How you're going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Paris?
Oh, yeah.
That keeps going through my head. That's what these women were thinking. We've seen what is possible. Is it World War I? Okay.
I don't know.
It is.
It's an old song.
Okay. Because they knew what the possibilities were. They had experienced this. They knew what they could do, and so they weren't content anymore just to,
And I think that's true today. Like, when you know more, you are required to do more, and when you know better, you're required to do better. And I think that that's a really motivating concept.
Education was just so important to women. And I think it's interesting that there was, like, after the revolution, there was still backlash. I laughed to myself while reading these couple paragraphs where it talks about how women who want a formal education would become masculine and unattractive, and that a knowledge of geography, political theory, and history would inevitably result in a monster indecent in her habits. And I thought that was really funny because, like, in the paragraph before, it actually, they say that sermons and satires were condemning women for being vain and superficial and materialistic.
But what they wanted them to do.
And so it's like, which one do you want? Do you want me to value beauty over intelligence, or do you want me to be informed? Like, and I think they were kind of like countering themselves.
In a book that was written, it's called Thoughts Upon Female Education. He says that it must be balanced. It must be balanced with singing and dancing and where was it? If they did not break free of the demands of gentility, the good doctor did not advocate a total abandonment of lessons in dancing, singing, needlework, becoming a helpmate, vocal music. You should not neglect the proper education of the lady. Though he did say they need to know some things. He said, you have to balance it, otherwise you're going to become that monster of...
And I'm glad
I'm
glad we chuckle at it, but I also want to bring it back that we're also not as far removed from it as we think. I think of my own experience within law school and being told that I was taking a man's spot, that he has, like, I was taking a family provider's ability to feed his family by being in law school. I was asked, how are you going to get married if you're a lawyer? I was like, not with you, for sure. And I did. I find a husband and I have a family as a lawyer because I have a supportive spouse. But that idea that women shouldn't be educated is not gone, unfortunately. It might be a little bit more mass and not popularized, but it's still a culture that is pervasive in our culture.
So it's time to wrap up. I'm going to give each of you, like, in a nutshell, what was like your main takeaway now that if somebody has not read the book and you think that they should read it, like, why do you think they should read it?
You want me to start? Okay. I would just say that, like with everything, it was just this constant thing that kept coming back to me, that the more you know, the better you can do. And if we knew, there were things I didn't even know about our own revolution because I hadn't sought it out, but knowing more means that you can do better. And so I loved it. I thought it was fun. She had a really good balance of humanizing stories with hard truths and compelling questions, asking like, what does this mean for women's education in the future? And I just thought it was a great read. So if you haven't read it.
I think one of my biggest takeaways was that everybody experienced hardships during the revolution. There was nobody that didn't.
Yeah.
And everybody is going through the same things today. We just need to look out for our neighbor and be kind and try to understand and admire what they did and try to do better ourselves.
I would recommend this book just because of how entwined women were, like I was talking about before, of how their personal lives became political, and I think it's a beautiful thing to in a time where women were supposed to be one thing, to see that they can be both genteel and also very ferocious. Yeah.
I think the biggest takeaway from this book is that we all have our tribes. We're a very tribalistic society today of you're in this group or that group and you're wrong or you're right. And within her book, that's not reality. That's not what history shows us, is we all are in our separate tribes, but we all have something similar. We have similar shared experiences and we can grow together, we can learn together, and we shouldn't demonize each other because we just create war. We just create hardship. We should create understanding. We should create growth. We should learn from our ancestors and not have to repeat their tragedies.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for everybody for sharing your thoughts, and thank you for coming today, and we'll see you next time.
All right.